When I first heard that Disney was making a Cassian Andor series, the first thought that came to my mind was why. I didn't hate his character in Rogue One, but his personality and goals were easily the least compelling out of that entire cast, and perfectly sum up how I feel about that movie in general. An interesting concept on paper, but ultimately let down by its jumbled and forgettable execution. That's not to say there's no potential in exploring the characters and the state of the galaxy Rogue One established, but I had zero faith in Disney to do it well, especially after how awful Kenobi and the Book of Boba Fett turned out to be. That's why I skipped Andor when it first debuted, and decided to finish watching Babylon 5 for the first time instead. I fully expected that would be the last I would ever hear about it. But over the next few weeks, I began seeing a lot of posts proclaiming it's the best thing to come out of Disney Star Wars. You can even find people who say it's the best thing to come out of Star Wars in general since the original trilogy. Even though all of the hype didn't equate to good viewership numbers for the show itself, the conversation surrounding Andor didn't die off completely like it normally does with Disney Plus shows after the shills have moved on, which is what got me curious. Based on what all these people were saying, Andor looked to be right up my alley, since I love mature science fiction, complex spy dramas, and I used to love Star Wars before Disney ran it into the ground. So, I put aside all of my misgivings towards modern Lucasfilm and gave Andor the chance to draw me in like it were any other new sci-fi or spy show I just found online. And I was pretty underwhelmed. There were definitely enjoyable and outright great aspects about it, which by itself puts it well above every other Disney Star Wars project for a fact. But when it comes to developing many of its characters and showing just how average people got the courage to fight back against the Empire, it's a mixed bag more than anything else. Now, I'm sure there are already Andor fans ready to descend from high heaven and proclaim I'm just a biased critic who's had it out for Disney Star Wars since the beginning, which, fair enough, I've made a few videos and comments that attest to that, but I want to state for the record that Andor disappointed me more than anything else. That can only happen if I was actually invested in its plot and characters to a degree, and that's the bare minimum I ask for in the shows I enjoy. Put simply, I judge every show I watch with the same standards, so even if it's something with an incredibly cheap budget like Babylon 5, or hell, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which despite being a teenage girl drama, I could still appreciate whenever it displayed good storytelling that rose above much of its cheap action and tired cliches. I can definitely say Andor stands above every other Disney Plus show based on that criteria, like having compelling characters who go on believable arcs, with several notable exceptions that is, and trying to tell a mature narrative about how the rebellion was formed without relying on shallow nostalgia bait to carry its standout scenes. Despite all of Andor's issues, I can respect the fact it was built around good concepts at its core, and in this video, I want to explore which ones it did well, which ones it fumbled, and how making a few tweaks and rewrites can make it a much better show overall. I'll be going over specific plot points and character arcs, so spoilers abound if you haven't seen the show yet. I'll also be referencing several popular books in the Star Wars Expanded Universe, as well as a few TV shows that share the same genres and story beats as Andor, so be prepared for many direct comparisons going forward. Alright, let's delve into Andor. Andor takes place roughly 10 or so years after the end of Revenge of the Sith, during the height of the Empire's unopposed reign over the galaxy, and the Rebel Alliance is little more than a few disorganized terrorist cells. The story follows Cassian some time before he enlisted with them, living as a wayward thief who steals equipment from the Empire to sell on the black market, to ensure he, his foster mother, and the droid can all live comfortably on the outer world planet of Ferrix. Things come to a head, however, when he gets held up by two security guards looking to shake him down after he visits a brothel on a nearby planet for information that could potentially lead him to his long-lost sister. Cassian is forced to kill them and go on the run, but his actions end up drawing the attention of several key figures from both the Empire and the Rebels. As the stormtroopers are closing in, he winds up being saved by his potential buyer Luthen, who, as it turns out, is a kind of fixer for the various Rebel cells, and wants to put his skills towards doing real damage against the Empire. At the same time, he's also being doggedly hunted by two young Imperial upstarts, Deputy Inspector Sulu Khan and Imperial Security Bureau agent Deidre Miro. They're both equally determined to bring him and his allies down for their crimes in order to make them face justice, or rather, their twisted sense sense of imperial justice. Judging from that premise, Andor probably sounds like a pulse-pounding action thriller, where Cassian and Luthen have to tread carefully if they hope to stay in the fight against the Empire, while Diego and Sewell employ increasingly more drastic methods to crack down on them and stomp out the rebel threat for good. Well, there are certainly elements of that, but Andor rarely does big action set pieces like this, which wouldn't be that big of an issue if it actually was about the characters I mentioned forming compelling partnerships with each other, and if Cassian himself wasn't such a boring and flat protagonist. There were absolutely several compelling directions they could have taken his character, such as delving deeper into his past skirmishes with the Empire, exploring what kind of clever survival skills he's developed living as a rogue thief, but above everything else, giving the audience the full context behind this line from Rogue One.
You might as well be a stormtrooper.
What do you know? We don't all have the luxury of deciding when and where we want to care about something. Some of us live it. I've been in this fight since I was 6 years old.
This was easily the most intriguing aspect about Cassian's character I wanted to learn more about. Was he a street kid from Coruscant who experienced the Empire's cruelty firsthand? A runaway conscript who was torn away from his family at birth? What if he literally meant he was a child soldier for the Empire, or even the rebels? Just imagine how fascinating yet tragic it would be if Andor showed how he developed his skills of infiltration, repressing his true emotions in order to become a more efficient soldier, and his willingness to neutralize anyone who could potentially be a liability to his mission all throughout his childhood, which would have gone a long way towards explaining why he came across as so cold and single-minded during Rogue One, but still had a compassionate side buried deep down. Sadly, the truth turns out to be a much more underwhelming answer, which is going to be a common trend across Andor. Instead of building a compelling context for why Cassian comes across as a one-note soldier archetype, Andor instead turns him into Jyn Erso 2.0. Not everything between them is the exact same, obviously, but broadly speaking, they are the same loner with a heart of gold type character whose primary function is to serve as a jack-of-all-trades asset that allows the other more vibrant and proactive characters to accomplish their goals, while contributing a shallow perspective on the events happening around them, since they're defined by very little outside of their actions. In other words, Cassian and Jyn are little more than plot devices in their respective stories. At least Jyn had fulfilling her father's legacy to motivate her, but Cassian usually gets shuffled from one major plot event to the next against his will, and despite his many entanglements with the Empire, he barely provides any deeper insights on them. All he has to say about the major conflict he's been roped into is that the Empire are, in essence, a bunch of arrogant assholes. And even though he's not willing to fight them head on, he's all for taking advantage of their stupidity when he can. Now, by itself, I do think this is an interesting perspective. I'd even say it makes Cassian slightly more interesting than Jyn at face value, simply for not being driven by the tired cliche of dead parents. However, sharing that opinion is pretty much as deep as it gets when it comes to expressing his perspective, and it still doesn't change the fact he's got the personality of day-old dishwater. I'm not saying Diego Luna turns in a bad performance, especially when he's interacting with Luthen or Marva. The issue comes from the dialogue itself, which rarely provides any opportunities for him to make Cassian a more layered and endearing character. And even when it does establish an interesting trait about him, it either ends up going nowhere or falling short of its full potential. The reveal of Cassian's backstory is a prime example of this, where it turns out he and his sister grew up as part of a Lost Boys-style scavenger jungle tribe on the planet of Kenari. His fight, if you can really call it that, began when a Republic cruiser randomly crash-landed there, and he was lucky enough to be adopted by two friendly scavengers before their main force arrived to bomb the entire planet for some arbitrary reason the show doesn't clarify, presumably killing everyone he knew, including his sister. Now, by itself, that's a reasonable enough explanation for why Cassian hates the Empire, but in terms of being a good backstory, it falls short in three major areas. Firstly, despite having the most traumatic backstory out of anyone in Andor, it barely seems to have affected Cassian's psyche or disposition all that much. I know that everyone processes grief in their own way, but outside of being a little slow to trust and antisocial, it's easy to assume the worst thing that ever happened to him was he lost his favorite pair of shoes, rather than everyone he ever knew and loved growing up. It's honestly jarring how other characters develop stronger convictions against their enemies, and deeper insecurities about their pasts than him, even though the losses they suffered aren't half as substantial as what he went through as a child, which defeats the entire point behind giving him such a harrowing backstory, since it also doesn't provide any character flaws he has to work through across the story, intrinsic motivation to ensure nothing like that could ever happen to him again, or even any clear sign that it left a major impact on him at all. Secondly, His backstory doesn't serve as the basis for any of his skills or knowledge. I could look past Cassian having the personality of a cardboard cutout if he at least brought some unique skills that made him invaluable to the rebels, but he's barely any better at driving or shooting things compared to anyone around him. And if that wasn't disappointing enough, his main traits of being a skilled thief and infiltrator barely get used or even acknowledged the further along the show goes. Andor also tries to showcase that Cassian's good at social manipulation and noticing little details that other people tend to miss, but I wouldn't say those actually count as established traits, since he only uses them for one scene each, and they never get referenced again. Take this scene, where Cassian somehow manages to speech check his way past these two thugs he owes money to in the most shallow, ineffectual way I've ever seen.
You're here with him. To what? To threaten me? Since when do you take orders from Nurture?
Don't answer that.
He said all I needed to do was stand here.
Good. You keep at it.
You think I'm messing around?
I hope so. I'm gonna do us a favor and not mention this happened.
How did merely pointing that out convince them to let him go? It's not exactly unheard of for criminals who want the same thing to work together, especially if it's money from the same person who owes them both. Hell, that was the basis for one of the most famous scenes in all of Star Wars.
Yes, I bet you have. Sorry about the mess.
Instead of making him look smart, which was clearly what this scene intended, Cassian only comes across as a complete dope for thinking this would actually get him off the hook, and makes the other two guys look like morons for letting him get away with it. What's more, he never tries playing these mind games to get out of a sticky situation again, not even when he gets arrested by the Empire later on.
I'm on my way to the store.
You need to back up. Stand right there. You look like you're sweating.
Well, it's hot.
Or you've been running.
Why would I be running?
Because you're a part of it.
Wait, no. I don't know anybody here. I'm a tourist.
Tourists don't run.
But I'm not running.
You got that right. That window is shut.
Alright, I'm being a little unfair here because we later find out that the Empire was arresting anyone they could based on whatever trumped up charges they could come up with. With all that being said, if the show's going to establish in an earlier scene that Cassian's good at persuading people, is it really too much to ask for him to do a better job of it than just playing dumb and insisting he's a tourist over and over again? It doesn't have to be successful, but at least you could say he made a sincere effort like the last time he tried it, instead of confirming the notion that scene was nothing but contrived filler. As for being more observant, that only comes up during the preparations for a bank heist mission in episodes 4 and 5, where he makes a suggestion that could potentially help sell their disguise as Imperial soldiers.
You should switch.
What?
He's left-handed. Should swap sides.
Why switch sides?
Skin is left-handed. You want your weapon on the outside.
What am I?
Right-handed.
Taramin?
Right.
Cinta?
Right.
Nemec?
Favors right, but shoots left.
Fine. Let's switch.
Anybody who's seen my burn notice video knows how much I love this kind of thing in stories, where characters have to think on their feet and account for the smallest details if they hope to maintain their cover behind enemy lines. Ugh. Unfortunately, just like with everything else, it never gets brought up again. Nobody even bothers to ask for any identification once they get to the bank, so I have to ask why they even bothered trying to emulate stormtroopers if it's this easy for anyone with a uniform to just walk right into what's supposed to be a highly secured base. Put simply, both of these supposed skills are just convenient plot devices, and none of them have anything to do with his childhood of sharpening sticks to go traipsing through the woods. However, it's the third issue with Cassian's backstory that drops the ball the hardest, and it's the most crucial aspect every author should get right if they're going out of their way to tell a backstory to begin with. In essence, it fails to be a compelling story by itself, and in making Cassian a more complex and appealing character by association. Cassian's tribe suffers from the same kind of bland and frankly manipulative characterization as the Na'vi from James Cameron's Avatar, where the narrative gives no deeper reason to be invested in them as individuals beyond the fact they're nature-loving hippies, or kids in Andor's case, who are being oppressed by an opposing force with more advanced technology and looser morals. Honestly, I would say the Na'vi are more sympathetic overall, because while their culture may be simplistic and one-sided, at least they were able to convey it in a way audiences could actually understand, or God forbid, even relate to on some level. What do I mean by that, you may ask? Well, even if Cassian's tribe were given more scenes to flesh them out, beyond the awkwardly edited snippets interspersed across the first 3 episodes, they would still be let down by the one factor that made all of these flashback scenes tedious to get through, and completely devoid of any emotional resonance. To put it bluntly, it's difficult for most audiences to connect to a group of people when they have no idea what they're saying to each other, because everyone in Cassian's tribe only talks in a gibberish alien language that the show doesn't provide subtitles for. Look, I'm not saying it's impossible to like characters who don't speak the same language, as I myself can name several prominent characters from movies and TV shows who don't speak English, but are still likable and endearing all the same. The problem is, as an audience member who's trying to figure out who these characters are and what kind of bonds they have with each other, what deeper insights are we supposed to be getting from Cassian's sister, for instance, when the only conversation she has with her brother goes like this? Now I'm sure this must be a very touching and heartfelt exchange from Cassian's perspective, but speaking as somebody who's only been introduced to them a short while ago and has no idea what they just said to each other, I don't see any relationship here that goes deeper than they care for each other on a base level. Call me crazy, but I tend to prefer stories that treat their characters like believable and distinct people, rather than shallow props that only exist to generate cheap emotions from the audience, but have no personality or depth of their own. And it's hard not to see Cassian's sister as anything but that, considering her absence barely seems to weigh in his conscience after the first episode, doesn't instill any kind of survivor's guilt or protector instinct like you'd expect a grieving older brother to have, and then he just abandons any attempts to find her and gives her up for dead after Marva tells him he needs to move on over the course of a single conversation, which really begs the question of how much he actually cared about her if that's all it took. Bottom line, Cassian's desire to find his sister only serves to be a contrived method to kickstart the main plot, and just like the rest of his backstory, gets completely tossed out the window once it served its purpose. You may be wondering why I'm harping on Cassian's backstory so much when it's mostly just a footnote in the grand scheme of his journey across Andor Season 1, which is meant to show how he goes from being a selfish mercenary to a committed soldier for the rebellion. Well, that's because outside of the melodrama with his sister, Cassian doesn't really have an arc. It's honestly amazing and a little funny that despite being the central character in a show that's named after him, and getting up to more exciting things like breaking into a bank or escaping from prison, almost every other storyline and character across Andor is more compelling and fleshed out than he is. I know I've been very critical of Andor up to this point, but the main reason I became more invested in characters like Luthen, Mon Mothma, Deidre, and Sewell, at least at first, is because unlike Cassian, not only do they have more memorable personalities, they also come across as more dimensional and multi-layered characters because the conflicts they go through test them on more personal levels, which in turn pushes them to make more drastic decisions that reveal more about what kind of people they are at their core. Take Luthen, for example. Between living a double life as a jovial art dealer on Coruscant, managing several contacts at once while also speaking in code to ensure nobody catches on to what they're actually doing, and making many tough calls to ensure the survival of the rebels as well as his own safety, his storylines usually ended up being more engaging to me than anything Cassian was getting up to, because even though he doesn't do too much outside of just talking to people, there's always a personal stake or an overarching goal he's trying to accomplish behind every conversation, and oftentimes, even the conversations themselves have more behind them than just bland exposition. One of my favorite scenes that best showcases this comes early on in episode 4, when we're introduced to Senator Mon Mothma as she visits Luthen's art gallery. After exchanging a few pleasantries for the benefit of her newest Imperial watchdog, it doesn't take long for both of them to get straight to business once they've set up their convenient excuse for going into the back room together.
Sun goddess and a serpent from the overworld sharing the same mouth.
If you can't deliver, I need to know.
I can't pull funds the way I used to. They're watching me now.
They're watching everyone.
This is different. They're everywhere.
I have many mouths to feed. I can only forage for so long.
I've found someone I think can help me.
We need funding, not more people to worry about.
Don't lecture me on vulnerability. You think I haven't thought this through? I'd be the first one to fall.
Why don't you take this on loan?
May I?
If your husband doesn't love it, I'll be glad to take it back.
What I really like about this scene is just how much information it conveys without directly stating it. It's obvious just how important Luthen's need for financial support and Mon Mothma's desire to bring in outside help are to them, given how quick they are to drop their friendly pretenses once they're in private. And it's clear from Luthen's instant dismissal of Mon's plan, and Mon's insistence that she knows all too well what the risks are, that the both of them are stressed to their absolute limit. You can also tell they've been having these kinds of meetings for a good while now, between how naturally they act around each other even while they're being watched, and how seamlessly they put on their calm and composed personas once it's time to go back outside. Even the cover story about Chandrilan traditions gets reincorporated later as part of Mon Mothma's overarching plot, which makes it come across as organic world building instead of innocuous fluff that doesn't serve any greater purpose across the rest of the narrative. All of that is what makes this one conversation have more weight and substance than anything Cassian's involved with, because despite all of the fear and paranoia surrounding what they intend to do, Luthen and Mon Mothma still have clearly defined goals and real conviction behind seeing them through to the end. Now, as much as I enjoy these two characters, there are a few things that hold them back from being truly great. My first major gripe is that this is only one of two scenes where Luthen and Mon Mothma share any screen time together, and from here on out, they go off on their own separate plotlines that don't intersect with each other at all, which results in making many of their scenes, even the ones I enjoyed, feel like they're caught in a deliberate holding pattern in order to pad out this season, so by the time season 2 rolls around, they could potentially end up going somewhere. I don't mind slow burn drama if it's carried by a character with an engaging personality and a good reason for playing things safe. That's why I didn't have a problem with Luthen sticking around his art gallery after dropping Cassian off on Aldhani, because not only did it make logical sense, it still permitted Stellan Skarsgård to provide his character greater depth by having him express his insecurities and hopes for the mission through several debates with his assistant. No, my biggest issue with both Luthen and Mon Mothma is how the narrative tries to frame the decisions they make across the show as these life-altering events that are meant to display how they're sacrificing pieces of their humanity to keep the rebellion going, but doesn't do enough to make them as impactful as they could be, despite how hard the actors try to sell it. Luthen, for example, sets off to convince the leader of another rebel cell, Saw Gerrera, to partner with a well-known fighter, Andor Krieger, but it turns out the Empire already knows about the raids they're planning and intends to kill them all in order to send a message. Luckily, Luthen has an informant in the ISB who lets him know about this development, and now he's caught in a bind where he doesn't know how he's going to be able to warn Krieger without tipping off the ISB that there's a mole in their midst. This is where we get my favorite scene in all of Andor, where Luthen decides the only choice to make is the hardest one of all.
You love your daughter. Krieger's men will be dying to make sure she has a father. We need heroes, Lonnie, and here you are.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm. Kindness, kinship. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. So what do I sacrifice? Everything! Just stay with me, Lonnie. I need all the heroes I can get.
Never let it be said I don't like anything about Andor, because everything about the way this scene itself is presented is damn near perfect. However, as much as I want to empathize with what Luthen's going through here, I can't really say I do, because Krieger's death isn't framed like a sacrifice throughout the rest of the narrative. Luthen's guilt doesn't make all that much sense because based on everything we're told about Krieger, it seems more like he gave up a dangerous liability instead of a valuable comrade. Even when Saw calls him out on his decision, he doesn't care about the loss Krieger's death will do to the cause at all. This is why the best writers usually stick by the rule of show don't tell. If you're going to show someone as stoic and composed as Luthen, have an emotional breakdown over the choices he's made, but don't provide any deeper context for why he feels that way, other other than he had to sacrifice somebody he was never shown to have any sort of friendship with, and who everybody else only saw as a reckless anarchist, then all it does is make this scene come across as overblown melodrama and undercuts Luthen's entire internal conflict. Imagine if, in Battlestar Galactica, when Starbuck gets stranded on a desolate moon and is presumed dead by most of the fleet, the show just immediately cuts to Commander Adama putting everyone at risk just to find her.
Keep all the ships on the search. We've left enough people behind. I don't want to leave Starbuck behind.
I'm just saying, committing the entire fleet to this search.
I said no! We're gonna find our missing pilot. And we're gonna bring her home.
I'm not saying that Adama isn't allowed to care about any pilot he doesn't know on a personal level like this, but when you remove all of the scenes that establish he views Kara like his surrogate daughter, it's hard not to assume he's just being irrational and plain stupid for getting so worked up over a total stranger as far as we can tell, and risking everybody's lives, including his own son, just to find her. You could argue I'm being unfair here because I'm comparing Adama's relationship with a fully fledged lead character to a minor side character who doesn't have an active role in the story. But even on this front, BSG does a better job of showing what impact a well-realized side character can have on the story depending on how they're used, and that comes in the form of Commander Adama's son, Zach. You see, about 2 years before the beginning of the show, Zach and Starbuck were planning to get married, but those plans fell through due to his untimely death in a flight accident. An accident that never would have happened if Starbuck hadn't passed him, even though she knew he wasn't ready. She's been living with that secret ever since, but then gets put into a situation where Adama finds out she's been hiding something about Zach, so decides to come clean, rather than lie to the man she's come to respect like a real father. What follows is an absolute tour de force for both Katie Sackhoff and Edward James Olmos's acting talents.
You did it because you were engaged.
Because I made a mistake. And I let that get in the way of doing my job. But I want you to understand that I...
Do your job.
Yes, sir.
And walk out of this cabin while you still can.
Zach may be a minor character who barely gets any screen time or dialogue across the entire show, but you'd have to be blind to not see the effect he had on these characters' relationship with each other, serving as the catalyst that draws them both together in the wake of his death, and then to drive them apart once the truth comes out about her involvement in it. Even so, it's clear from his desperation to find her that Adama still loves her like the daughter-in-law he never had, and despite still being angry with Kara, he can't bear for those to be the last words he ever said to her. Losing her now would be like losing Zach all over again, and for a man who's been shown to go to extreme lengths for the people he cares about most, regardless if they're blood-related or not, it makes perfect sense why he's willing to risk so much, even going as far as defying the president of the colonies herself, in order to find Starbuck before it's too late.
This isn't military, it's personal. Neither of you can let go of Kara Thrace because she's your last link to Zach.
You don't know anything about my brother.
Don't even begin, Captain.
Crap. Unacceptable. Whatever it is you feel about this. The recovery of one pilot is a military matter.
All right. It's military. Fine. And you're both perfectly aware that you are putting the lives of over 45,000 people in the future of this civilization at risk. Now, if the two of you, of all people, can live with that, then the human race doesn't stand a chance. Clear your heads.
This is more of a personal gripe on my part than a detrimental flaw that ruins the whole story, since I still think Luthen's speech is well written overall, and has many compelling implications behind it. I just wish the show made more of an effort to put the audience in Luthen's shoes by showing that Krieger and his men were more than just blips on a view screen, and help us to understand that Luthen's decision to sacrifice them isn't as easy or clear-cut as he tried to make it out to be. I'm not arguing that Krieger should have been given an extensive backstory dump, or for his death to be set up as dramatically as Scar betraying Mufasa, but if Andor wants to push the idea that Luthen really is using the same ruthless tactics as his enemies, having him directly portray somebody that the audience can put put a name and a face to on some capacity helps to convey that idea better, instead of making Luthen look like the kind of guy who gets over-emotional whenever he accidentally steps on an ant. That's what makes those scenes from Battlestar Galactica so much more cathartic and endearing, because almost every character the writers use to evoke emotions from the audience does have a name, a face, some history depending on how important they are, but most of all, a clear human element to them. When Commander Adama finally reunites with Starbuck at the end of the episode, it's a genuinely beautiful moment seeing the two of them smile at each other after everything we've seen them go through just to get here. That's the kind of deeper context Luthen's story is missing, which is a shame because if he did develop that kind of dynamic with Cassian or anyone else, and had been forced to sacrifice them for the greater good, it would have left a much more powerful message. The same can be said for Mon Mothma, who, on paper, also has an interesting story of trying to maintain order in the galaxy while having her fellow senators and even her own family scoff at her efforts, which drives her to fund the rebel cause even harder. I especially liked the scene where she admits to her friend that she knows the Empire is watching her, but views it as the ideal cover for her to do what they least expect. And as long as the two of them keep up their fake smiles, nobody around them will be any wiser towards what they're actually doing.
I know they want me, and I want that. Because as long as everyone thinks I'm an irritation, there's a good chance they'll miss what I'm really doing.
What are you really doing?
Raising money. It will appear to be another of my benevolent and useless irritations.
You haven't answered my question.
And I won't. You're better off not knowing. Or perhaps you find my politics a bit strong for your taste. Perrin's on his way over. He knows none of this. He's not to be trusted. Smile?
There you are.
When I first saw this, I couldn't wait to see where Andor would go with Mon Mothma, between having to keep up this front with her own family in addition to her enemies, and exploring just how many more lines she's willing to cross in order to help the rebels prosper. As it turns out, hardly any, because while I do like her character and concept, and Genevieve O'Reilly's performance, Mon Mothma's storyline ended up being the second least engaging parts of Andor, because from start to finish, there's never a point where she's at risk of being found out, and the only big moral boundary she ends up having to cross is partnering up with a somewhat sleazy businessman in exchange for introducing her annoying and ungrateful daughter to his son. Don't misunderstand me, political intrigue plots don't need constant gunfights or explosions to be interesting, but when they mainly consist of their characters doing very little to accomplish their goals, reveal new information, or even face any clear opposition that holds them back, then it ends up reducing all of the intrigue into people just standing around the same rooms, being paranoid about each other for no identifiable reason. After several episodes of Mon talking about the same things over and over again with no advancement, I couldn't help wishing that Andor's writers would take some cues from The Expanse, mainly Christian Avasarala's storyline, even though she spends most of that show just talking to various people as she tries to uncover the conspiracy her government's wrapped up in. What keeps it engaging is the fact that she's always doing something to further her agenda any way she can.
Our operatives caught an OPA agent with Martianist theft composites. Mars is working with the OPA.
No, it can't be.
Yes, we have proof.
The Martians wouldn't do that.
I think you love them too much. I leaked to DeGraff that Mars was giving stealth tech to the OPA. He did what I thought he would. The spike in chatter was panic. They were calling to see if anything was missing. And since they had to ask, it means that they didn't give it to anyone.
My diplomatic credentials have been revoked. I've been banned from Mars for life.
We may have stopped a war. For a while, anyway.
Do you remember a couple of us played cards at your house?
I remember I didn't like to be excluded.
Well, you always lurked on the side, quiet, obedient, but watching. I was terrified for you. I didn't know why. And now I do. You will do anything to win. Just like your father. I won't play with you. Ever again.
I don't have early class today.
We planned this.
You did.
Get your coat. It's not up for discussion.
Are you serious?
You're only doing it to show off.
What?
Just go.
What would I be showing off?
You're involved somehow.
That's just so hurtful.
See? There you go.
Go where?
That's my point. It's all about you, isn't it? It's always all about you.
Is this really how you'd like to start the day?
I didn't choose this conversation.
I so appreciate the support. This is a charitable fund we're establishing.
So I've been told.
Please take no offense. I'd prefer not to owe any favors. I'd feel far more comfortable paying you for your trouble.
I'd like a return invitation. I have a 14-year-old son. I'd like to bring him with me.
You can't be serious.
I'm not asking for betrothal.
Then what are we talking about?
An introduction. Her daughter's 13. She'll soon come of age.
Is that your only offer?
I'm afraid so.
Tay will see you out.
It's a lot to think about.
I'm not thinking about it.
That's the first untrue thing you've said. It's been a pleasure.
As much as I like Luthen and Mon Mothma, I can't help wishing their stories were as expansive and well-structured as the ones in other mature sci-fi shows that tackle similar themes. By contrast, Cassian's journey is structured in a similar vein to something like Metro 2033 or The Road, where its focus is about him always moving between different locations and meeting a wide variety of people he doesn't spend too much time with, but still learns valuable lessons through their shared experiences, which contributes towards making him a more confident and noble character. In theory, at least. In practice, not only do the characters Cassian meets barely have any personality to them at all, you would be hard-pressed finding many scenes that aren't mainly focused on delivering drawn-out, redundant exposition, over-developing even the tiniest spark of chemistry or friendship between them, not even with people who are supposed to be his longtime friends like Bix.
You killed 2 corpos and came home to hide. Put the entire town at risk and now there's Imperials on the street.
Your crazy boyfriend tries to get me killed, and I'm the villain.
You need to get as far away from here as you can.
I will. You won't have to worry about me anymore.
Be careful, Cass.
You too.
I know she's still resentful about Imperial soldiers beating her up and killing her new boyfriend during their search for him, but this falling out barely has half the dramatic weight it should, because up until now, she's always been cold and dismissive towards him, judging from the way she treats him, even after he confesses he was only defending himself against 2 corrupt soldiers looking to shake him down. It's not hard to imagine that the only reason she went to warn him was just so he would be able to pay her back the money he owes her later. I'm not saying that's what I believe, but since Andor does such a poor job of showing Cassian develop a friendship that goes deeper than he knows the other person's first name, and a few innocuous tidbits, the idea that these are the people who inspired him to become a better person, or even risk his entire livelihood to save them, is very questionable at best. The 2 characters who best exemplify these issues are Nemik and Skeen, who could have been far more interesting characters that left a believable impact on Cassian if they were handled better. Even so, they still stand out compared to everyone else on Cassian's Bankai's team because they're the only ones he has semi-interesting conversations with, like Nemik expressing his preference of using older machinery instead of newer Imperium models, and Skeen revealing he's a former gangster who's out for vengeance against the Empire. They each represent 2 distinct sides of the rebel cause: the idealistic, somewhat naive belief that freedom is worth fighting for at any cost, and the pragmatic rationalist standpoint that acknowledges how much the deck is stacked against them, but is still committed all the same. It's too bad that this is as far as Andor goes towards adding depth to these 2, since there isn't much else to their characters beyond Nemik being the young upstart of the group, while Skeen's the gruff, no-nonsense one who doesn't really trust Cassian. But the one scene I did end up enjoying was when Skeen forces him to reveal the fact that Luthen hired him for the job. It was one of the few moments where Cassian actually gets to comment on the situation he's in and lay out some hard-hitting truths that harkens back to a standout scene from Rogue One.
He won't say why he's here, where he's from. He doesn't say what he believes in, and now this? Who brings a treasure to a robbery?
We don't have time for this.
I need to know who I'm riding with.
I'm being paid. Paid to be here. You can't live with that? I'm not worth it? I'll walk away and wish you luck. But that's what it is.
You knew this?
The choice was take him or call it off.
Call it off.
You should have told us days ago.
Maybe so.
It just would have been something else.
It's really only the money.
To take a risk like this? Come on.
Maybe you're the one that's afraid.
Of course I'm afraid. But there's a difference between fear and losing your nerve. You want out of this. Make a choice. Don't use me as an excuse.
Finally, a compelling conflict that tells us more about Cassian as a character and should affect his dynamic with the group going forward. Maybe their carefully laid out plan will all go awry because they don't trust him to see it through. Earning their respect must be a pivotal moment in his development, and who am I kidding, you already know none of this actually happens. I would have at least thought Nemec, the most diehard devotee of the rebel cause, would completely change his attitude towards Cassian going forward, but this is all they have to say about it.
Struggling to understand why my faith doesn't calm me. I believe in something. Why am I so unsettled? I mean, you have nothing. You sleep like a stone. Read about you last night. Not you, specifically, not Clem. Although I'm assuming that's not your real name anyway. The role of mercenaries in the galactic struggle for freedom. Weapons are tools. Those that use them are, by extension, functional assets that we must use to our best advantage. The Empire has no moral boundaries. Why should we not take hold of every chance we can?
Well, you're half right. The Empire doesn't play by the rules.
So you think it's hopeless, do you? Freedom, independence, justice. We should just submit and be thankful.
Do I look thankful to you?
No. But I'm glad that you're here. No matter what the reason.
Okay, so he basically just wrote a strongly worded disapproval letter? It'd be one thing if he actually was good friends with Cassian and made him see that through all their conversations, he does care about something more than just being paid. But this is literally the second of the only two semi-personal conversations they have before he ends up dead, and outside of providing covering fire for him once, I don't see how anything else he did would end up becoming a major inspiration for Cassian later on, but I'll get to that in due time. As for Skeen, it does turn out to have an impact, but not the kind I was hoping for. After they escape from the Imperial base, in a very nice looking set piece I have to admit, and while the other team members are doing what they can to save Nemec's life, it's now time for Skeen to reveal his own secret to Cassian as they're sitting alone together.
40 million apiece. Between the two of us, we could be the winners here.
It's an odd rebellion for you.
Oh, I'm a rebel. It's just, me against everybody else. I saw it the first minute you came into camp. You're just like me. We were born in the hole, and all we know is climbing over somebody else to get out. Split up the winnings.
I did everything I could.
It's not you, Doc.
And it's not what you think either.
Excuse me.
Where's Skeen? Skeen! Skeen!
He's dead. He wanted to take the money and leave you here.
You disgusting bastard. Taramin warned me.
I'm taking my cut. The number I was promised. I'm leaving you the freighter and what's inside. I did my job. And I wouldn't stick around if I were you. Return this to your friend.
Wait. Nemec's manifesto. He said to give this to you.
Look, I know all the diehard Andor fans go crazy for this scene, and I understand what it's going for. That Skeen was meant to represent the kind of selfish, immoral asshole Cassian could become if he keeps following his current mindset, and this is supposed to be the first character-defining step towards who he becomes in Rogue One, but it just wasn't earned. For one thing, the twist wasn't all that shocking given what Skeen told him earlier. Secondly, it undoes all of the respect and mutual understanding built between him and Cassian, not to mention it makes his constant suspicion about him and his strict attitude towards upholding their duties very puzzling in retrospect. While I do think those two factors cheapen this moment, I could easily overlook them if it wasn't for my biggest issue with this scene. No matter how many times I run this scenario in my head, I don't see how Skeen could ever think he could convince Cassian to do this. Sure, Cassian admitted he's only on the mission because he's being paid to be there, but it's a pretty big leap to assume he's the dishonorable kind of mercenary, given how much of a team player he's been up to this point. If he had been working his own angle to get all of the money from the beginning, like Skeen evidently was, he would have sabotaged them in any number of ways before now, like allowing them to all be killed once they got discovered, or deliberately flying in a way that would get them all crushed like Nemik was. If that's the kind of person Skeen assumes Cassian is, then what makes him believe he wouldn't just kill him to take his share anyway? On the flip side, while Cassian has been shown to do drastic things to protect himself, Skeen couldn't have been more wrong when he insinuated that the two of them are both survivalists who mainly look out for themselves. Even if Andor deliberately kept Cass from bonding with anyone on the team in order to set up the possibility that he could easily betray them, the fundamental flaw behind this entire moral dilemma is that he doesn't want the money out of sheer greed or malice. Episodes 1 through 3 took the time to establish in painstaking clarity that Cass is doing all these risky jobs not just to support himself, but Marva and Bee as well, with the main goal of using all the money he's acquired to buy a new home and identities for all of them, not to mention find his lost sister along the way. His intentions couldn't be more noble and selfless, but we're supposed to believe that he would take up an offer from a lying, backstabbing thug to screw over good people he has no quarrel with, just to line his pockets with blood money, assuming he lives long enough before Skeen gets the idea to kill him and take his share the moment he lets his guard down. Nothing Cass has done across all of Andor or Rogue One supports the idea that he would ever do something this selfish or morally bankrupt. Not even to the two local thugs who tried to shake him down earlier, considering he did pay them back in the end. Maybe he could have been pushed to make that decision if he was really desperate for the money, and the share he received wasn't all that much to begin with, but we later find out that he did have enough to get both him and Marva off of Ferrix, and since he also gave back Luthen's priceless crystal to Vel, that's enough to tell that his integrity matters more to him than money. This scene doesn't work as Cass's big confrontation with his dark reflection, because Andor made him too honorable to ever become someone like Skeen, which ends up boiling it down to just one of those outrageous choices in a role-playing game that's only there to ask the main character if he wants to betray everything he stood for up to that point, and be a sadistic asshole just for the hell of it. The same goes for his desertion afterwards, since by all accounts he didn't betray them, and has every reason to leave so he can protect the people he really cares about, so once again, it can't help but come across as just melodrama. Since I'm sure I've pissed off every Andor fan at this point, I might as well go the full 9 yards and admit that I didn't think much of Nemik's manifesto, or fully bought into the idea that it's what inspired Cassian to take up the fight against the Empire. That's not to say I think it's badly written, and I do like certain parts about it like this.
There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. I know this already. Alone, unsure, dwarfed by the scale of the enemy. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks. It leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear. The day will come when all these skirmishes and battles, these moments of defiance will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and then there will be one too many. Remember this.
I think my main issue with it is that when looking at the entire message as a whole, it's basically telling the reader that the main strategy the rebels are using to fight the Empire is to throw as many people into the meat grinder as possible, in the hope that at some point in the future, all those countless sacrifices will eventually overwhelm them and grant the ones left standing their freedom. If you take away the uplifting music and harrowing visuals, it wouldn't be hard to frame this as the ramblings of a deluded anarchist, mainly because Nemik doesn't make any direct allusions to the kind of tyrannical things the Empire has done, or provides any deeper incentive for joining the fight beyond a nebulous idea of freedom. I can't imagine how any random Joe who reads this would immediately be persuaded to throw away their life for some intangible concept instead of things like a safer environment for their families, the chance to restore their desecrated planets to their former glory, or even the opportunity to avenge the people they've lost perhaps? Maybe that all sounds cliche, but if you recall, Luke Skywalker didn't want to fight the Empire just because Obi-Wan told him he had to free the galaxy. True, that's what he and the rebels ultimately wanted in the end, but what drove him to cast aside his normal life on Tatooine was the chance to help somebody in need, honor his father's legacy, and avenge the family he lost. My point is, Nemik's manifesto isn't built on much that could conceivably push any normal person into joining up and sacrificing their own life for no other reason than it's the right thing to do. It's not half as persuasive or inspirational as Lega Damar's speech towards his people in his efforts to liberate Cardassia from the Dominion's control.
Cardassians have never been afraid of war. 7 million of our brave soldiers have given their lives to fulfill our part of the agreement. And what has the Dominion done in return? Nothing. And to make matters worse, we are no longer masters in our own home. Instead of the invaders, we have become the invaded. Our allies have conquered us without firing a single shot. I call upon Cardassians everywhere. Resist. Resist today. Resist tomorrow. Resist till the last Dominion soldier has been driven from our soil.
Even though it's from a very warped perception of patriotism, you can clearly see how Damar is appealing to the core values of his people in order to inspire them. It's not just the idea of freedom he's tempting them with, but the chance to reclaim who they used to be, while also acknowledging that even though the price may be steep, it's better to die fighting for what they believe in over rotting away in a gilded cage. One last thing that didn't sit right with me in this manifesto was the notion that anyone who defies the Empire becomes an unwitting soldier for the cause. It reminded me of a similar plot point in one of my favorite expanded universe novels, Allegiance, which was all about how a squad of stormtroopers defected from the Empire after the events of A New Hope. One of the most memorable parts of that story for me was when Luke and Han asked them if they wanted to join the Rebel Alliance, only for their leader Larone to turn them down. As much as he was disillusioned by the Empire, he still saw the rebels as little more than reckless troublemakers, and didn't believe that signing up with them was guaranteed to make the galaxy better in the long run. That perspective was always so fascinating to me, because even though we know that the rebels win in the end, it's easy to see why he would have that opinion given what little they've accomplished up to that point, and what the Empire's done in the wake of the Death Star's destruction. What I'm getting at is Nemik's manifesto doesn't really acknowledge that as far as the galaxy is concerned, the rebels are just a bunch of reckless terrorists. That's one area Andor portrays very well for all its faults, and the fact that Nemik doesn't seem to realize that some people may have reservations about being associated with them given everything we've seen them do, only makes him come across as a naive kid at best and a deluded anarchist at worst. Honestly, what frustrates me most about Andor's characters was how much I wanted to like them, because in spite of all my criticisms, I wouldn't say any of them are badly written or acted. There are just too many missed opportunities when it comes to developing them into compelling people, building complex dynamics between them that grow and evolve over the course of the story, but most of all, treating them as more than just background extras until the big climactic scenes where the narrative suddenly needs them to have emotional scenes with the main characters that was neither properly set up nor earned. Those three things are what separates a merely good story from a truly great one. And I wanted to demonstrate that by comparing similar scenes from Andor to other shows that I believe do those things exceptionally well. However, if we're talking missed opportunities and mixed opinions, it's high time I start delving into the other aspect Andor's most notable for, its depiction of the Empire itself. Even though there are many parts of Andor that didn't leave much of an impression on me, the one aspect that did live up to all the hype was how it portrayed the ruthless yet pragmatic operations of the Empire through the characters of Deirdre and Sewell. Instead of being clumsy, over-the-top buffoons who wouldn't be able to hit a barn right in front of them, like most modern Disney villains, Andor breaks away from that trend in the first few episodes by depicting the two of them as hard-working and capable individuals who stand apart from their peers because they both take a personal pride in enforcing the strict doctrines of the Empire in their respective territories. What really endeared me to them was how Andor went out of its way to show them struggle with everyday grievances you would find in any other corporate 9-to-5 job, like having to work under a grouchy supervisor who doesn't appreciate all the extra effort you put in, doing your best to live up to your boss's expectations despite the lack of experience, or simply doing things as mundane as filing reports. I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking that sounds pretty boring, but unlike many other plotlines in Andor, both Deirdre and Sewell have to contend with many kinds of obstacles just to get anything accomplished, and each breakthrough they made often revealed a deeper facet to their personality that made them even more interesting. That's what made Deirdre's scenes at the ISB a particular highlight for me compared to anything Cass, Luthen, and Mon were doing around the same time, because even though she's meant to be one of, if not the central antagonist, she's easily the most proactive character in the entire show, at least in terms of accomplishing her goals.
She's demanding the raw data from the incident on Ferrix.
Sir, it is my feeling that this is part of an ongoing effort to steal proprietary Imperial equipment in anticipation of an organized rebellion. I have 3 previous case files on my desk that begin to suggest a pattern.
Your feeling? Alert me when this materializes into something more definite. Until then, confine future activities to your sectors. Thank you, Lieutenant.
Bosnian Prime?
It's useless. They haven't broken, misplaced, or mislabeled a single military component in the past 12 quarters.
Well, maybe there's an unofficial ledger. You should go. I didn't realize how late it was.
I'm staying if you are.
I don't know what I'm doing.
Yes, you do. You're onto something.
He's right, though. It's too spread out to be organized.
But you don't believe that.
If I was them, this is how I'd do it. I'd spread it out.
It's too random to be random.
2 more files each.
I believe our sector protocols, as described in the ISB Code of Conduct, are being violated by Supervisor Miro. You determined her request was out of order and in violation of the chain of command.
That's not accurate. You advised me to reinforce my suspicions with data and to be careful in my work going forward.
Careful? I'd be curious how many people at this table will think it careful that you found a way to access our sector data without ever filing a request.
Is that true, Dedra?
Yes. I'd like to know if anyone here believes the rebellion plans its actions around the artificially constructed boundaries of our sectors. Do you really think the rebels care about the lines we draw on maps?
You think the relevance of my work has been supplanted?
Systems either change or die. Sir.
Imagine if everyone in this room played as loose with the rules as you.
I'm wondering where we'd be right now if everyone here showed the same endeavor as Supervisor Miro. For the moment, I'm reassigning the Morlana sector to Supervisor Miro. Ferrix is of great interest to her and has clearly become a distraction for you. Thank you all for the lively session. Dedra, if you'd walk with me a moment. Well played.
Thank you, sir.
Watch your back.
Deirdre goes on a far more well-rounded and compelling journey in these few scenes than anyone else across all of Andor, because unlike them, her storyline is based around how she uses her own resourcefulness to get things done. Rather than being driven by a flat side character, she comes up with a clever solution to get past all the bureaucratic red tape in order to accomplish her goal. I was also relieved by the fact that she wasn't portrayed as a shallow girl boss who overcompensates for her gender by putting down everyone around her in an obnoxious, over-the-top way, which would have been so easy to do given Disney's track record and the reputation of the ISB in Star Wars canon. She's just a determined agent out to solve all the disruptions she believes the rebels are causing throughout the Empire, or healing the sickness as her boss put it. That doesn't justify all the suffering she's helping to promote across the galaxy, of course, but it was still refreshing seeing such a rational, level-headed person working with the Empire for a change. Well, at least at first. While Deirdre and the segments focusing on the Empire were my favorite parts of the first few episodes, I began to notice that as the show went on, all of those relatable and humane aspects fell to the wayside, in favor of something I like to call obligatory the Empire are evil douchebag scenes. Yes, I'm fully aware that the Empire was always intended to be evil space Nazis from the beginning, and that Andor is intentionally trying to highlight how tyrannical they are for the sake of its underlying message, but the issue is, the show often pushes their evil deeds to such far extremes that at a certain point, their villainous actions go right back around to becoming parodies of themselves, and making the characters involved in them look comically stupid as a result. Take this scene, for instance, where Deirdre interrogates Biggs after she's been arrested by the Empire. It starts off well enough, with her trying to intimidate Biggs into giving her information about Cass and Luthen. Deirdre even plays up a smart angle by pointing out she has nothing to gain from holding out on her, seeing as one of her associates already spilled everything he knew about her partnerships and the equipment she helped to steal. So putting herself through the same agonizing torture just to keep a secret she already knows about would be pointless. However, all of Deirdre's cunning goes out the window in this next exchange.
The very worst thing you can do right now is bore me.
You're not gonna believe me anyway, are you?
I suppose not. She's all yours, Dr. Gorst.
Thank you.
This probably doesn't seem like a big issue, since by all accounts, Deirdre has every reason to torture Bix. But when looking at this scene from a practical standpoint, while also keeping in mind precisely what Deirdre's trying to get out of her, this isn't a smart decision on her part at all. Contrary to what this show and many other popular Hollywood stories would have you believe, torture isn't actually that effective at making somebody give up reliable information, especially the kind that inflicts psychological trauma like this.
It's repeat listenings that cause the most damage. Are we ready?
Remember the swamp? Remember my song in the swamp when I was like, well, ever since.
Sure, it's a very brutal and creative method of torturing somebody with, but considering the state it leaves both Bix and her friend in afterwards, I don't see how Deirdre got anything useful or even slightly coherent out of either of them. And in the end, Bix didn't tell her anything that brought them any closer to capturing Cass or Luthen, which is particularly ironic because during this time, Cass is already in an Imperial prison, and yet nobody's managed to identify him even though they know what he looks like. I'm sure it seems ridiculous for me to be criticizing a villain for doing something evil, but the issue here is that up until now, Deirdre wasn't portrayed as being this careless and wasteful. The reason that she was able to figure out that the rebels were coordinating robberies across the galaxy is because even though they were hitting random targets across different sectors, she recognized that they were using the same methods to steal the same kind of equipment. And that clever deduction is what led to Bix being captured in the first place. My point is, it doesn't make sense for the character who made all those careful decisions to be so willing to scramble the brains of the only person she's found who has a semi-personal relationship with the two fugitives she's after before conducting a full interrogation first. Hell, Bix was even somewhat cooperating with her up to that point, but she still decided that provoking her into having a mental breakdown was a better option than using her as a proxy to lure Cass and Luthen into a trap, or even just sitting back and letting her try to contact them while monitoring her every step along the way. Despite how hard the scene tries to make Deirdre look imposing and perceptive, she mostly comes across as a short-sighted fool who put her own petty ego over getting actual results, which couldn't be more disappointing because up until this point, Deirdre already was an imposing villain because of her ruthless intellect. I wish I could say this was a one-time slip-up, but then she makes what is arguably the dumbest decision out of anyone in Andor when she decides to put herself in the line of fire by walking around the streets of Ferrix during Marvel's funeral. For context, this is all set up to be one big trap to either capture or kill Cassian, and she thought that the best place to be was not in some cozy command center, but right in the middle of over 100 people who all hate the Empire with a small escort? Did nobody think to warn her that if a fight did break out, she could easily get overwhelmed and trampled by the crowd, which turns out to be exactly what happens? This is why Luthen ended up supplanting her as my favorite character in Andor. I don't see how we're meant to believe that Deirdre is an intelligent character who got to where she was by not underestimating her enemies and picking up on small details other people tend to miss when at the drop of a hat, she abandons all common sense just to follow the stupid evil villain tropes Austin Powers often made fun of for no other reason than Andor needed the Empire to be a bunch of bumbling buffoons for this scene to work. Well, that and the writers wanted to engineer this forced poignant moment between her and Sewell, and where do I even begin with Sewell? If I had to pick the one part of Andor that was the most disappointing for me, Sewell's story would take the gold medal easily, because for a good chunk of the series, I was genuinely invested in everything surrounding him. Like Deirdre, he's also a freshly minted Imperial enforcer looking to pick up the slack from his co-workers and enforce the law to the best of his ability. What really got me to respect Sewell wasn't just his determination to bring in Cassian for his crimes, but also the sheer contempt he feels towards everyone around him who would rather let them go unpunished if it meant making their sector look good for the review board.
Will you be sitting up with us, sir?
I think I should, don't you?
Absolutely, sir. Show force, boost morale. If I may, sir, hats off to you and Chief Inspector. 2 men dead, line of duty, colleagues. It's outrageous.
Exactly. The thought of anything less than full engagement on a case like this.
Unconscionable, sir. Dereliction of duty at the minimum.
It would be, wouldn't it?
Corporate tactical forces are the Empire's first line of defense, and the best way to keep the blade sharp is to use it.
I'll pass along your kind words to the Chief Inspector.
So,
Despite his beliefs being based around a warped perception of justice, I've always been a big fan of stories that can successfully show how a villain thinks that their actions are serving a greater good beyond themselves. I may not have been rooting for Sewell to succeed, but I could still appreciate all the effort he put towards standing by his principles, and trying to make up for his failure after Cassian escaped on Ferrix. That's what made him feel like the most human character in all of Andor, because in stark contrast to many other parts of the show where important details are merely told to the audience, we actually get to see his struggles dealing with his despondent boss and his disapproving mother firsthand, which made his determination to prove them both wrong and gain recognition for his hard work all the more engaging. Everyone's been praising Stellan Skarsgård, Andy Serkis, and Denise Goh for their performances in Andor, with good reason for sure, but I think Cal Sola deserves just as much credit for how well he conveys Sewell's quiet frustration towards everything he's dealing with, while also highlighting the fact that despite his ambitions, he's still a young upstart who lacks the self-confidence and charisma you'd see from a respected Imperial officer. So with all of that going for him, why is Sewell the most disappointing character in Andor, you may ask? Well, it's right when he meets Deidre where everything that made him compelling and somewhat sympathetic all starts to unravel. Now, I actually like this interrogation scene, since Deidre is still acting like a shrewd and calculating professional, while Sewell's using this chance encounter to set the record straight and prove he's a capable ally even if she doesn't want his help at this time. It's the next scene where they meet face to face, where Sewell's entire image and everything that made him interesting gets completely tarnished.
Sewell Karn.
I know who you are. Have you been waiting out here?
Yes. I'd never lie to you. I needed to find you, and it's not that easy to thank you for what you did and what you're doing. Try to follow on the conversation we had last month.
That wasn't a conversation. You were brought in for questioning. Are you stalking me?
I know you work here, and I come sometimes to see if I'll see you.
Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in right now?
I thought I had ruined my life. After meeting you and discovering you understood how dangerous Cassian Andor was, and just being in your presence, I've realized that life was worth living. Perhaps my deranged belief that there was something better fated for me in the future was a dream worth clinging to.
You come near me again, you pursue any of this, and I swear I'll have you in a cage on the Outer Rim.
Now, I've seen many arguments online insist that this turn makes perfect sense for Sewell, claiming he's always been a simpering weasel who's desperate for attention, and never had much dignity or backbone to begin with. However, not only do I strongly disagree with both those notions, but even if they were true, it still doesn't change the fact that this scene destroys any potential Sewell had in becoming a standout villain, on top of making it damn near impossible for me to take him seriously ever again. For starters, if he was always this weak-willed and subservient, then why would he ever go behind his boss's back and defy a direct order? Sewell was the one pushing everyone around him to actually do their jobs, and once he was given the opportunity to make the arrest, he didn't let his initial nerves get in the way of carrying out the search for Cassian. You could argue this cowardly persona was hinted at when Cass and Luthen held him up at gunpoint, although given the circumstances, I would say he conducted himself as well as any defenseless soldier in that scenario, and even after he's been incapacitated, he doesn't waste any time alerting the other Imperials to his position or trying to stop the escaping fugitives. Even when he's being chewed out by the ISB for his failures, he still maintains his composure and doesn't flinch from the idea that he was doing the right thing, at least in his eyes. All of this only confirms that Sewell may be out of his depth when it comes to being in the line of fire, but even when everything he's worked for starts to crumble around him, he does his best to move past those setbacks in order to fulfill his duty, and stands by his decisions to the bitter end. But Randy, I hear you say, surely all that time at his monotonous, dead-end job and living with his mother must have driven him to this level of desperation, right? As a matter of fact, no, because even when his boss talks to him about his disgraced service record, Sewell once again pushes through his initial embarrassment and makes it clear that he intends to set the record straight by catching Cassian. He gets straight to work on that goal by making constant inquiries about information on Cassian without asking anyone for help or complain about how difficult things have been for him. I would be willing to buy into the idea of him keeping tabs on her if it was so he could track their progress on the investigation while he continues to work independently with the help of Sergeant Mosk or perhaps other disgruntled Imperials he could convince to join his cause. If he really wanted to make an impression on Deidre, creating this potential ragtag team that could work outside the bounds of the ISB would be a great way to prove his worth. Not to mention it reinforces the overarching idea behind Sewell's character and many others like him across the Empire. What is that idea, you may ask? Well, just as Nemec's manifesto claims there are many rebels waiting in the wings across the galaxy, then wouldn't it also stand to reason that there are many others out there like Sewell and Deidre who are willing to fight just as hard to preserve the Empire? After all, a tyrannical regime like the Galactic Empire wouldn't have become so powerful if it didn't have fanatical believers like them propping it up. Believers who are just as dangerous as they are devoted. The point I'm trying to make with all of this is that by turning Sewell into a pathetic simp, Andor is not only contradicting much of what it established about him before now, it undermines all of their efforts to show that there are competent and even somewhat relatable people working for the Empire. Did he honestly think that stalking Deidre and telling her what a good job she's doing like a mouth-breathing incel would not only flatter her, but somehow convince her to recruit him, instead of provoking her into arresting him, file a restraining order, or simply laugh in his face and telling him to get a life? Nice job proving your mother you're the exact kind of desperate loser she accused you of being, forever validating her low opinion of you, Sewell. Everyone loves to laugh at their mistakes across the original Star Wars trilogy, but putting the ineptitude of stormtroopers aside, the individuals who actually run the Empire have always been portrayed as a serious threat to the entire galaxy. And while they certainly had their blunders, I wouldn't say they make half as many costly mistakes as the one portrayed in Andor does on average, especially one in particular that deserves to be up there in the Hall of Infamy of dumbest moments in all of Star Wars. As much as it pains me to say it, because I love Andy Serkis, the overall aesthetic of the place, and the underlying message behind what's probably the most beloved episode of Andor, I wasn't a fan of the prison arc. Even if the people Cassian interacted with weren't just a bunch of one-note red shirts, or if there was any satisfactory answer behind why the Empire thought a hostage workforce was a better option to make these Death Star parts, instead of just getting droids to do it, particularly when the Trade Federation was able to build a droid army with far less resources than the Empire has now, and the fact they already use droids for many of the important tasks. The one crippling flaw that ended up ruining not just this plotline, but the entire image of the Empire for me, was just how poorly managed and outright contrived this entire setup was. To give credit where it's due, setting up a prison in the middle of the ocean that's also equipped with an electrified floor are both smart ideas. Unfortunately, if you thought that not shooting all of the escape pods, alerting the rebels on Hoth with a reckless hyperspace jump, or getting overwhelmed by Ewoks made it impossible to take the Empire seriously, Andor is here to one-up all of those mistakes with this little gem.
You think they're listening? You think they care enough to make an effort? Like you would know. All they need to do is turn this floor on twice a day and keep their numbers rolling. Why bother listening to us?
Good luck to you.
Nobody's listening! Nobody's listening!
What? Why on God's green earth would the guards not be listening to them? Okay, they have their elaborate security system, and I can understand that they care more about them meeting their quota than listening to the complaints about their work conditions. However, we later find out that the Empire's been shuffling people to different floors instead of releasing them, which drove them to kill everyone on level 2 when one of the newcomers exposed the fact he'd been transferred from level 4. So in other words, the Imperials running this prison have a vested interest in making sure these inmates stay in line and don't discover the truth. But what? They're too lazy and too stupid to put one guy, or even a droid, on a security camera and report back any unusual behavior before the riot starts? They can't even be bothered to make sure they don't organize themselves and easily overwhelm them once they work up enough courage and support, at least right up until the very last second. And even then, the measly 12 guards who actually patrol each floor are completely powerless to stop them. You're probably thinking I'm grossly exaggerating this, but that's literally what ends up happening, because once Cassian disables their supposedly foolproof security system by releasing a moderate puddle of water on the floor, the 2 armed guards are easily taken out by a bunch of malnourished prisoners throwing tools at them, all while they're standing on an elevated platform and firing into the packed crowd right below them. I mean, there's stormtrooper incompetence, and then there's refusing to even fire your weapon despite being faced with so many unarmed targets, and unlike in A New Hope, they're not deliberately letting them escape. This is why I've been asking why the Empire didn't just get a bunch of droids to do this, considering it would have been more cost-effective to have them and civil technicians on standby, rather than setting up this elaborate system that turned out to be pretty easy to beat once the prisoners organized themselves. Even if you use the argument that the guards have become complacent after all this time, it doesn't change the fact that if an Imperial probe droid had been here listening in to Cassian and Kino's escape plan, or if a security camera was in this bathroom to ensure nobody sabotaged the pipes or left the sink on, thus inadvertently disabling the most effective weapon, then none of this could have happened. I also find it funny that these guards, who killed an entire floor of people before they could launch a riot like this, only wait until after they've mowed down numerous guards and have gained a strong foothold in the base before they electrocute all the floors. I thought the whole idea behind this expendable workforce is they could easily kill them off if they ever become a liability, but now that the plot needs Cassian to escape, and didn't account for them just taking their special boots, I guess the guards aren't allowed to be as ruthless and efficient as they were portrayed to be earlier? It really doesn't get more contrived than that. Is it really too much to ask for these guards to take even the smallest precaution and just make sure they're not all standing up and planning a rebellion when they should be asleep in their bunks? As much as I wanted to be invested in this storyline about Cassian rallying these prisoners together and coming up with a plan to subvert security on the level of Mission Impossible, Andor dropped the ball by making the Empire sabotage themselves through their own incompetence at every turn, as well as cheapen all of the dramatic weight behind Cass and these prisoners pulling off this miraculous escape, since it barely cost them anything besides a handful of no-name red shirts, which in turn makes them look stupid for not trying something like this earlier. This entire plotline gave me severe whiplash from scene to scene, between loving the ones showing Kino's realization that nobody's getting out, which pushes him to make his show-stealing speech, only to then be shown something that completely sours the mood and reminds me that these characters aren't the brightest.
We are, at this moment, in control of the facility. Wherever you are, right now, get up. Stop the work. Get out of your cells. Take charge and start climbing.
We know. They fried 100 men on level 2.
Now we know that when they say we are being released, we are being transferred. And that ends today.
There is one way out.
Can't swim!
Look, I know this is meant to be inspiring, the idea that they're willing to face death rather than continue doing manual labor for the Empire and all that, but is Kino really the only person who's going to raise any objections over having a slow, agonizing death drowning at sea? Not only is it absurd that any of them could believe, or actually even manage to swim to shore from here, nobody even suggested the idea of locking this place down and commandeering the next prison transport that arrives. Sure, we later find out that the Empire sent a bunch of ships to kill the stragglers, but it's still odd that nobody makes that suggestion before jumping headlong to the watery graves. What bothered me the most about this section is that when you stop and think about it, all they did was shut down the generators while leaving everything else fully intact, which means they won't have much issue starting this place back up again once they all leave. If they were all willing to die anyway, couldn't some of them have stayed behind to smash up the machinery, or find a way to sink the facility itself? I'm just saying, it would have sent the same message, but also ensured that the people who died and have died here in the past didn't go out in vain. In the end, I guess it doesn't matter either way, since in the context of Andor's greater narrative, the prison plotline is mostly inconsequential, aside from serving as a very loose inspiration for Cassian to join the rebels later, and to showcase how tyrannical and imposing the Empire is, only to then take a sledgehammer to all of the stakes, drama, and intrigue they try to build, by then revealing they're actually a bunch of stupid, arrogant, and exceedingly pathetic fools that any schlub could take out no problem. The thing is, while I do agree that those are key factors behind some of the Empire's biggest defeats, there comes a point where making them look too incompetent only ends up hurting the image of both the villains and the heroes. Am I saying characters like Grand Moff Tarkin and Admiral Ozzel didn't make misguided decisions based on their arrogance? No, of course not. However, they also had believable logic behind their actions. After spending most of A New Hope overseeing the Empire wipe out numerous rebel soldiers and their allies, it makes sense why Tarkin isn't all that concerned about their attempts to blow up the Death Star. Don't get me wrong, it was a reckless miscalculation he ended up paying for, but when you consider all of the pilots they'd killed up to that point, the Death Star being mere minutes away from destroying their sworn enemies, and the fact everything depended on Luke making a 1 in a million shot, it's not so crazy for him to underestimate their chances. And according to the official novelization, along with several EU books, he was often criticized fairly harshly across the Empire for that lapse in judgment, which is what drove them to crack down much harder on the rebels in The Empire Strikes Back. As for Admiral Ozzel, he was trying to catch the rebels off guard with his quick approach to Hoth, and while it was a costly mistake that pushed Vader to terminate his services, it still alerted the Empire to the planetary shield all the same. Even though both of these Imperial officers made flawed judgments, they still had a believable context behind why they made those decisions. Whereas in Andor's case, Deirdre torturing Biggs to the edge of her sanity for no good reason, Sewell devolving into a pathetic simp when he was poised to become just as dangerous and resourceful as Deirdre was at the beginning, and basically every battle strategy an Imperial uses in this show either have very flimsy context to justify them, or are blatantly done to highlight their aforementioned stupidity and arrogance. If you're telling a story about a tyrannical regime enforcing their power across the galaxy, and how the average people they oppressed worked up the courage to oppose them, it's best not to show said tyrants constantly being outsmarted or even sabotaging themselves through their own stupidity, while the heroes mow down scores of them with little to no consequences, and they can barely do a thing to stop them despite all of their resources and manpower. At that point, your serious sci-fi drama ends up having no more weight or substance than Spaceballs, while also not being half as entertaining. This is the main reason why the final uprising on Ferrix fell completely flat for me. I fully understand why people love it, and unlike Nemec's manifesto, Marva's speech did have many inspiring ideals behind it that I could believe would push these people to fight the Empire to the bitter end.
We've been sleeping. We took their money and ignored them. We kept their engines churning, and the moment they pulled away, we forgot them. The Empire is a disease that thrives in darkness. It is never more alive than when we sleep. And maybe it's true, maybe fighting's useless. If I could do it again, I'd wake up early and be fighting these bastards. Fight the Empire!
The problem is, since we don't get to experience any of the struggles Marva describes beyond watching Sola's people turn over her house, coupled with the fact that we don't know anything about the people of Ferrix, it ended up turning this whole sequence into a giant slap fight between two sides that the audience is given next to no reason to care about on any deeper level. This entire battle was a confusing mess to follow, where sometimes it seems like the Empire was mowing down civilians by the truckload, while other times we see people running towards the chaos instead of running away, or just plain silly moments where an officer sends a trooper to go apprehend the bell guy in the middle of the fighting, only to then show him be yeeted off the top of the tower. I'm sorry, but what exactly did this accomplish beyond reiterating how inept and unthreatening the Empire is? What baffles me the most about this whole sequence is that for a show that wants to emphasize how ruthless and pragmatic the Empire is, Andor rarely shows them directly doing anything all that detestable. For example, you'd think once the initial fight breaks out, these troopers would be all too eager to start lighting up these people the same way the clones did to Ki-Adi-Mundi. But not only does it take a good while for them to start shooting indiscriminately into the crowd, we barely see them take out half a dozen targets on screen. And even when the officer tells them to fire at will, they just end up taking careful pot shots at the people fighting back while letting most of the fleeing civilians get away unscathed. Taken by itself, this scene looks more like the stormtroopers are trying to limit the casualties instead of violently putting down a justified uprising. Now compare this to how menacing and relentless the Empire was established to be in the first few minutes of the original Star Wars. In just that opening shot and the ensuing battle, we can clearly see just how much they outclassed the rebels on every front as the first wave mows down almost everybody in this corridor while only taking minimal losses on their side, and that power dynamic only gets more pronounced when Darth Vader himself walks in, tosses aside the captain like a rag doll, and takes Leia prisoner with no regard to her ties to the Senate. The irony here is that Andor is supposed to be the point in time where the Empire is a much bigger threat than they were in the original trilogy, since nobody's directly opposing them now. This is supposed to be the big event where the gloves come off and they do whatever it takes to maintain their power, and yet throughout most of this battle, Andor has only demonstrated how incompetent and ill-prepared they are, even when they're supposed to be slaughtering these people. If the Empire really wanted to send a message that they won't stand for any act of rebellion, why don't they just do a bombing run on Ferrix? It's basically confirmed that they're hunting down everyone on the planet, so what's stopping them from clearing out their people and laying waste to this planet from orbit, especially when they never got any confirmation that the person they're looking for was even at the funeral. The biggest issue that plagues this scene is that it's torn between two diametrically opposed ideas. On the one hand, it's clear this is meant to be a major rallying point where average people band together against the Empire for the first time, which will then inspire other planets to rebel and eventually form the Alliance. On the other hand, it also wants to convey that the Empire is a domineering force that won't go down so easily and will do whatever's necessary to maintain their control. While I do like both of these ideas, the problem is this battle is constantly flip-flopping between them to the point where everything becomes a confused mess, and the entire battle comes across as a pointless struggle. To put a finer point on this, if we as the audience have been told next to nothing about who these people are, aren't given much of any opportunities to sympathize with them through seeing what heinous things the Empire's put them through, and watch Cassian not display any strong feelings of horror, anger, or regret towards watching this happen towards people he's known for most of his life, then how are we supposed to have any feelings towards them one way or the other? I'm not saying I didn't feel a little bad watching several of them die during the riots, but based on the context I just laid out, how are we meant to be invested in them on anything deeper than a superficial level when the narrative itself treats them as little more than basic NPCs? On the flip side, there also isn't much dramatic weight behind the Empire winning or losing this battle either, since, well, they're just fighting a bunch of nameless nobodies our own main characters have next to no investment in over a planet that isn't all that important to them. If Ferrix was one of the core planets that provided a valuable resource or position for the Empire, I would completely understand why they'd be so adamant to stamp out this rebellion and make sure the surrounding planets don't get the same idea. But since Marva clarified that this is just a backwater outer rim outpost that was content to ignore and be ignored by the rest of the galaxy, it really begs the question why they don't just level the place and use that to set the example. In other words, I really don't see how this battle wouldn't be viewed as a superficial victory by either side, since the people of Ferrix didn't force back the Empire in any meaningful way, and the Imperials themselves mostly bumbled around during the fight after spending most of the battle being easily pushed around and barely gaining any ground. Superficial is a good word to summarize my overall opinion of this scene and Andor's depiction of the Empire in general. Even though they're willing to do the same horrific things as the original version, like torturing people unnecessarily, forcing innocent planets to play host to the hostile garrisons, and even performing all new laws like unlawfully arresting people to force them into slave labor, they end up being surface-level conflicts compared to similar scenes from the original Star Wars movies or other shows in the same genre, because unlike them, none of these things bear an immediate or lasting impact on the main characters, or even helps the Empire accomplish any of their goals across this season. Outside of identifying Cassian as the murderer of the two security guards, every other plan an Imperial comes up with to track him or other rebels down ends up falling apart in spectacular fashion. When you couple that with all the times they're constantly outsmarted and even outright defeated by people who realistically shouldn't have stood any chance against them, while barely doing anything to reassert themselves as a serious threat, then I just don't see why any of them should be taken more seriously than the average bumbling stormtrooper, or be seen as anything more than one-dimensional, self-sabotaging supervillains. I want to make it clear that at the beginning of the show, Deirdre and Sewell really were my favorite villains in any Disney Star Wars project. The fact they were portrayed as ordinary people committed to their goals, instead of maniacal psychopaths or bumbling doofuses, is what made them more engaging and human than anyone else in Andor, which got me to understand why Andor fans were raving that this was the best depiction of the Empire in all of Star Wars. But once I got to the finale and saw all the contrived hoops the show went through to engineer that scene between them, it became clear that Andor wasn't interested in showing they were believable and somewhat sympathetic people working for the Empire, and more focused on turning these two into an ineffectual duo whose cartoonish personalities and harebrained schemes won't provide any interesting depths or new perspective into the villainous side of Star Wars the same way characters like Grand Admiral Thrawn, Kreia, or Darth Malgus did. Although I said Sewell's character was the most disappointing part of Andor for me, it's a close toss-up between that and the wasted potential both he and Deirdre had. In spite of everything I've said so far, I wouldn't call Andor a bad show by any stretch. I've seen a lot of people writing it off because it doesn't feel like Star Wars, and while I do have my own issues with how it disregards certain parts of the lore, many bland and generic aspects of the presentation that could belong to any sci-fi story, and the forgettable soundtrack, I would still say Andor is the best thing to come out of Disney's Star Wars, because for all of its faults, it still set out to tell a mature narrative featuring mostly original characters, and explore different aspects to the Star Wars universe we haven't seen on screen before. Given the choice, I would much rather have more shows made in that same vein than the kind of shallow nostalgia-bait dreck Disney usually pumps out, where the characters are little more than lifeless action figures, and there's no deeper plot beyond shuffling between badly choreographed fight scenes. That being said, I also believe it's important to acknowledge its shortcomings as well, because if there's some minuscule chance the creators of Andor sees this video or others like it, it'll help them iron out those flaws. And even though I've personally written off Disney canon in general, it's still worth acknowledging when they release something that's moderately decent. The thing is, I really wish I could say Andor was more than just moderately decent, because outside of Solo becoming Deidre's whipping boy, I could see how almost every other character, plot point, and concept I took issue with had the potential to be truly great if they had just been developed more thoroughly, and if Andor was fully committed to exploring the nuances between these versions of the Empire and the Rebels. I'll always respect this show for doing things we don't typically see in most Star Wars stories, but if it really is aiming to be more morally complex and adult-oriented, then I would say it's fair to critique it by those very standards, which is why I referenced other sci-fi stories outside of Star Wars that I believe Andor could learn a great deal from when it comes to fleshing out those ideas. In any case, I would still recommend Andor to anyone who wants to watch something on Disney Plus with more substance than The Mandalorian, Kenobi, or Ahsoka, and I'm definitely interested in seeing what's going to happen in Season 2. Well, at least as far as Cass, Luthen, and Mon Mothma are concerned. Until then, I'll keep my fingers crossed and try to release future videos in a more timely manner. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm the Elusive Eye, and may the Force be with you.